in time to bring on Garth. So let me bring up my nice little page again. Speakers. So this is another one that I think it's fair to. So I'll tell the story. So we started the ComfyCon stuff on the 16th of March, 17th of March, and Garth came to us and said, "I want to do this talk. It's not a tech talk, but I think it's really relevant." And we went, "Okay, let's do it. It's going to be something that I think everyone will find really useful, not just for the current crises, but for moving forward as well." So Garth, when I find the page, Garth is the Asia Pacific SOC manager for Rapid7. You actually might have seen him mentioned in Ricky's talk as well. Prior to his tech career, he was a professional firefighter and volunteer surf lifesaver in Sydney, Australia. He's going to be talking to us about meditation for crisis professionals. So Garth, the stage is all yours.
Okay. Let me just share PowerPoint. All right. Oops. I have many screens going on at the moment. Apologies. Play. Start. All right. Is that the correct one showing?
We don't see your screen. Did you do the share screen button?
Yeah, I have. Oh, sorry. Screen saving has failed to start. Oh, okay. Looks like Zoom has crapped out on me. I'll try it again.
That's all right. Everyone is providing some interesting messages in the chat. Mark Aldo, I wonder if he'll be fielding any questions today.
Ooh.
There we go.
All right. Okay, you seeing the right one?
Swap displays.
Okay. Cool.
Fantastic.
All right. Okay. All right. So meditation for crisis professionals. Hi, I'm Garth. All right. So what is it that what is this about? So what we're seeing is that is unprecedented. Unless you've gone through the SARS virus, then the vast majority of us have not seen anything like what we're seeing right now in terms of having to be forced to stay at home, having to see this in the news constantly, having to see and having this as an international response. So social isolation can be harmful to our mental health. If you're imprisoned, being in solitary confinement can be seen as the harshest of punishments. There are psychological studies that have shown that it can be actually a form of torture. And in a 2015 study, a psychology meta-study found that social isolation can be twice as harmful as obesity in reference against mortality rates. And many people don't have healthy management strategies in place. And it is likely that we will have a mental health crisis during this pandemic. It is likely that people will overdose on alcohol and drugs. It is likely that people will self-harm in this crisis. So we'll be discussing a number of the ways that people cope with stress during pandemics, and some of this you might see in yourself, and some of these you might see in other people, and maybe have a little bit more compassion for them. So this is just something that has worked for me. Meditation doesn't, meditation is not for everyone. All I just want to do is dispel some misconceptions about meditation. And if you've already got some healthy stress management strategies in place, then that's great. But if this talk only helps one person in the audience, then it's totally worth it as far as I'm concerned. Please note that meditation is not a replacement for psychotherapy. I'm not a mental health professional. Meditation is not a replacement for psychotherapeutic drugs. So if you are on medication or through the process of getting medication, please don't use this as a replacement. Please work with your mental health professional. If you need help, then go get help. If that's a friend, if that's a medical health practitioner, if that's a mental health practitioner, then that is extremely important. So a little bit of my background. So I was very, very lucky that where I spent the majority of my summers was in a remote beach community in New South Wales in the Royal National Park. And from when I was a real little kid, I was involved in surf life saving. So I got my first certificate when I was about 8 years old. And from when I was real young, because we would, in this remote community, people would fall off cliffs, people would break their arms and legs, people would drown. And even when, as young as 10 years old, I was involved in some of these emergency response efforts. I was about 13 when I was called in my first helicopter for a rescue. And we also used to get a bunch of people that would crash their hang gliders on the beach as well, and then would have to explain to them that they had a 45-minute walk to the nearest road. And when I got a little bit older, I ended up joining the New South Wales Fire Brigades. And as part of that, we also did hazardous material and things like, and rescue generally. So I did a number of vehicle extractions and things like that. And just kind of like a little story that punctuates maybe a little bit what we're feeling now. So one time, probably the most traumatic thing that happened to me during, as a firefighter, was where I went to a car crash. It was an elderly couple, or probably in their late 50s or 60s, and they crashed into a car pole. The gentleman who was driving was unconscious, and his wife was entrapped in the car next to him. And as a firefighting professional, I jumped in the back seat, supported his head to make sure that he was still breathing, even though he was unconscious, while other people were administering things like oxygen to him from the other side. This gentleman was very, very injured. I was just sitting there with his cerebrospinal fluid dripping down my hands. He was very bloody, he was very holding on, and his wife was screaming at me at the time to do something. And my role was not to do anything. My role was just to support his spine. And I think that, I'm really strongly reminded in this moment in terms of everything that we're going through is also horrible, and yet we have to do nothing at this point. And so it's with that sort of mind that meditation has been useful for me. And anyway, so that's just a little aside. And then later on, I eventually left the New South Wales Fire Brigade. Actually had a building collapse, which crushed my spine. And whilst I was going through rehab, ended up going through IT, and then getting re-educated and going through InfoSec. I've had a really nice InfoSec career. I've worked with Telstra Cert, but probably one of the most important things was when I worked for the Royal Commission in Institutional Responses to Childhood Sexual Abuse. And we will come back to that a little later, because again, some of the stress management strategies that we're learning in the Royal Commission are directly applicable to what's happening today. So what's my meditation background? So from when I was probably about 13 or 15, I also had a very, very strong interest in meditation. So I've studied the Indian tradition in terms of a few different types of yogas and the original texts, Upanishads, and studied Taoism through martial arts, that's Chinese spirituality, studied Buddhism, studied the Western esoteric traditions, so Plato, the Republic, and all that sort of thing. But what I've really noticed and what I found really interesting is that meditation is not really a belief system. So while there may be a belief system that's attached to meditation, all these different isms, so you can be all the way from being completely non-violent to doing blood sacrifices, but the practices themselves are basically the same cross-culturally. And that's what I find, even many cultures that have nothing to do with each other, historically have still co-developed these practices, which makes me theorize, and a number of other people theorize, that these sorts of practices are just kind of like built into our psyche in some way, on some archetypal level. So When I was working for the Royal Commission, as I was saying, we had to study a lot of the symptoms of stress, vicarious trauma, and the diathesis stress model. So because we're in the Royal Commission, we're regularly exposed to these horrific traumatic stories of people that went through abuse situations, and those stories were just things that you would find on top of a photocopier, or you'd have to do as part of data handling. And so you would be exposed to these all the time. And a number of, the level of stress was quite high amongst the people that worked there. So what are the sorts of symptoms of stress when you're exposed to these sorts of things? Well, change in sleep patterns, change in energy and engagement, changes in eating and drinking, self-medication, so increase in drugs, alcohol, nicotine, caffeine, worrying about things, constant worrying, negativity, and sorts of nervous behaviors as well. Nail binding, pacing, fidgeting, and we're taught to observe that both in ourselves and part of our co-workers as well. And there's also the idea, and so this is also part of the vicarious trauma effect, in terms of you don't have to go through trauma yourself to necessarily display trauma. During September 11, 2001, when many of us saw the Twin Towers be collapsed, there are a number of people who just watched it on television. There are studies that show that a number of people got things like PTSD, had stress symptoms, simply from watching it. And this was very similar in the Child Abuse Royal Commission as well, that we were affected by just reading and viewing and hearing these sorts of stories as well. And then you also have the diathesis stress model, which is basically kind of like stress as a cup of water. So we all of us have a set point of how much stress that we can cope with in any one particular situation. In Australia, we've had fires, we've had floods, and now we have pandemic within 1 year. We've got a lot of things happening, and all of us have a particular level of how much stress that we can cope with at one particular time before it starts to break out into negative stress patterns. And so while you may be okay in this particular moment, maybe another month down the track, you may actually start having stress symptoms and may want to come back to this talk. So stress symptoms in a pandemic. So this is from the CDC, the Psychology of Crisis paper, which I've referenced at the end. One of the things that you can see in a crisis is the level of uncertainty. People choose to use the same news stories quite often, regardless of the accuracy of the provided information. I don't know about you, but I'm seeing a lot of people doing news reporting from Facebook at the moment. And also at the same time, people may discount news sources that are distressing or overwhelming. We have some of the symptoms in terms of fear, anxiety, or dread. In some circumstances during a pandemic, that level of fear, that level of fight or flight can actually help people push people forward to a positive direction, but sometimes it can push into a negative direction as well. We also have these feelings of helplessness and hopelessness. So people at some point may have depression symptoms and just give up because it's also horrible and overwhelming. So an article recently in the Harvard Business Review talks about the Kubler-Ross grief cycle in respect to the pandemic. I don't personally love the idea of grief. I personally would feel that it's more about intense emotions that people can't quite deal with, but I'm an armchair psychologist and completely unqualified. The person that helped with this article was David Kessler, who actually co-wrote the 5 Stages of Loss with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. He works with the LAPD and the Special Reserve for Traumatic Events, and also works with the Red Cross Disaster Services. So he might be probably a slightly better person to talk to about that sort of thing than me. But what I have seen is a number of people like moving through this kind of grief cycle. I've had a number of conversations where somebody was clearly having stress symptoms and yet so they were shortness of breath, they were tense, they were kind of panicking, and yet they were clearly in a state of denial about this pandemic and what's actually happening. Or they may have looked angry or depressed about it. And you can clearly see these people like moving through this grief cycle. Okay, so meditations in higher stress professions. So there's a great book called Mindful Responder that talks about mindfulness programs in relation to emergency services. And a lot of the quotes that are on in successive slides are from that sort of thing. So there are a number of emergency services that are using mindfulness programs or meditation programs to help their responders reduce the amount of PTSD, help with stresses in their workplace. You're also seeing another area where we're seeing a lot of meditators, as we're starting to see this in mixed martial arts. So a number of people, Hicks and Gracie is pictured there. Great little scene in The Incredible Hulk where he's with Edward Norton being taught how to lower his blood, his heart rate, so he didn't turn into the Hulk. So you're seeing some of the mixed martial arts practitioners like John Jones, Conor McGregor, the Makitas, Diego Sanchez, Anderson Silva, and many more using variations of meditation programs in terms of how to deal with the stress of being a competitive fighter. Part of that is coming from Josh Waitzeken, who was a chess prodigy. His life was loosely taken to create the film Searching for Bobby Fischer. And post his chess career, he turned his attention to Chinese martial arts and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and works quite closely with the Machitas at the moment in sports Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, doing mindfulness programs. And he's also using the same sorts of techniques on the New York Stock Exchange with financial traders to help people like manage their stress responses. So the psychological effects, the physiological effects of meditation, this comes from Mindful Responder. So it's basically the relaxation response. So, and being able to instigate the relaxation response at will. So we're seeing things like reduce blood pressure and heart rate, how to lengthen the breath, how to regulate muscle tension, how to calm the nervous system. And being able to do this at will is extremely useful, or just even if you can't do it as well, being able to have an associated practice where you can just go away for 10 minutes, 5 minutes, half an hour, and just get yourself out of the mind state that you're in and into a different mind state. This comes to the psychological effects of meditation. So things like increased focus on the immediate moment, reduction of negative thoughts, improved emotional well-being, better management of stresses, and improved sleep. So now I'll talk a little bit about meditation itself. So what's the purpose of meditation? It's to develop attention and to slow or stop the grasping of the mind. So cool little story in Zen was a novice monk comes up to the head monk, goes, "What's meditation about?" Head monk goes, "Tension." Cool. So he walks away, comes back next day. "Hi monk, head monk, what's the purpose of meditation?" The monk says, "Attention." Happens on the third day as well. So one of the most important things is develop attention as a practice. And that's developing awareness of what's actually in front of you rather than the way that your mind makes it up to be. And to slow or stop the grasping of the mind. So the kind of analogy is quite often used as the monkey mind. The part of our mind, the part of our thoughts that we don't necessarily feel as our own, but they press themselves upon us. And a big part of meditation is seeing ourselves, getting a recognition of ourselves as something being separate from our mind, separate from our thoughts. So a fairly junior level of the meditation practice is being comfortable in the silence of your own mind and recognizing yourself as having some level of being, a level of self without thoughts. So how to develop attention. So I'll talk about a little different way of different sorts of practices that are within meditation. And the point of this is to give you a much broader sense. Meditation, even though we've got that lovely little picture there of the meditating Buddha, it's not just about sitting on the floor. And in fact, sitting on the floor is just a very, very small part of meditation practices. There are a number of practices involving the mind. So concentration practices that involve concentrating on a single thing. So maybe a dot on the wall, maybe a religious figure, maybe a flower. And then you also have mind practices that are meditation without attachment. So staring at a wall, seeing the wall as a whole without having any attachment to any particular part of the wall. You also got practices that involve visualization. So, maybe seeing a flower with your eyes closed. And you also have practices of energy, so chakras or specific types of visualizations and things like that. All very woo stuff, certainly not for everyone. Okay. Practices of attention involving the body, including observing your own posture. Observing the posture is kind of really useful for tech workers, and just seeing how you're holding your body during the day. You also have practices like hatha yoga, tai chi, qigong, walking practices, that sort of thing. And then you also have a number of practices that are around breath. So yoga pranayama, being able to watch the different stages of the breath, how you integrate with the breath, how your breath affects the mind. You also have mantra yoga, so singing or chanting specific tones or notes. This is just all different things that appeal to different kinds of people. And your way in, like if you're interested in any of those, that's totally fine. And that can be your way into developing a practice. So the postures of meditation. There are many, many different postures that you can take. In fact, that the whole point of meditation is to be able to integrate any posture as a meditation practice. So you have different types of sitting practices that could be cross-legged on the floor, or they could be in a chair. You have a number of standing practices, again, something like a hatha yoga, but also like qigong as well, where you're just standing with your hands up. And then you have walking practices. That could be as simple as just watching your breath as you take an afternoon walk. But also could be more complex in terms of like a Tai Chi sequence or a Bagozhang sequence, walking around in a circle. And you have more complex things like shamanism, dancing around a fire and things like that. And then you have a number of prone meditation sequences as well. People seem to really like these ones because they're fairly easy to get into. And that whilst you're prone on the floor, you can really examine the state of relaxation. And also it's totally fine to fall asleep and kind of watch yourself moving from a sleeping state to a waking state. Is the purpose of the practice itself. And there are also a number of practices that not just lying on the floor, but lying in your normal bed where you actually examine your level of attention in the dreaming state. So what's next in terms of, there's no real, can't go out and get taught at the moment. For meditation. So these are a few of the online resources that I've found useful in my life. Headspace is an app written by the ex-Buddhist monk, Andy Puddingcombe. I believe it's an English app, which is quite popular. I've used it a bit. It's not a bad little introduction. You also have the Waking Up app, and this by Sam Harris, and a book by the same name. I haven't used the Waking Up app myself, but a number of my friends in the InfoSec space seem to really like it. So I'm comfortable with recommending it as a way in. Sam Harris is a popular thinker and one of the atheist authors. So pretty good one in terms of a meditation practice that has no religious background in it at all, because Sam himself is an atheist. One of my favorites is Brain FM. Brain FM is a pseudo-randomized noise generator that is tied to chord progressions and uses it uses binaural beats and things like that. So, and it's you've got different states in the Brain FM app as well, in terms of they've got a focus app, they've got a sleeping app, they've got like a nap app. So the few different states the Brain FM app has got, and it's just music that you listen to with headphones on. Focus app will kind of similar, but it uses pre-recorded music, where I like the Brain FM app because with the pre-recorded one, if you've been listening for a while and you start to memorize the music, then my brain will start to preempt the music. Whereas Brain FM, because it's got this kind of randomized generator before it, my brain can't preempt the music and therefore listen to it in the same way. And then there's also me. If people really want to reach out to me personally and ask me questions, if there's enough people that are interested, I'd run a class. It's not a problem. Where, you know, I'm not doing anything else, so I'd be happy to do that. And if that helped anyone, that'd be great. Couple of references at the end. This will just be in the end of the slides, but that's pretty much it for my talk. I'll have a look at the slides, the questions, and see if there's anything come in. Any questions at all before I wrap up?
I'm not speaking. I'm not speaking again.
Yeah, I was seeing a lot of mouth moving.
Okay, let me try that again. So
I think I was on mute too, wasn't I?
You were on mute too.
Wow.
Whoever put on Twitter that this is a professional con, you're a liar. I appreciate it, but you're a liar. What I was saying was, no, thank you very much, Garth. I think it's really important for people to, it doesn't really matter what they do. It's just finding something that works for them and finding some way that they can help themselves and their mental health. And I know there's also been, Silverly on the chat has also offered to assist people in meditation as well. So look, guys, if that's something you guys would be interested in, and if Garth is willing, we can try and organize something along that nature as well, because I think it's quite a good approach to get started and to start, you know, working on these stressful situations. And I think obviously you've had a lot of experience. I wasn't actually aware of the Royal Commission experience, but that I can imagine would have been a very stressful time, a very anxiety and fear inducing as well.